All right, there you go. All right, so welcome and thank you for attending tonight's installment of Duchess Land Conservancy's Earth Matters webinar series. My name is Brian Straniti, and I'm the Outreach and Preserve Manager with the Duchess Land Conservancy. Tonight, we're super excited to welcome Dr. Robert Thorson, a captivating author and professor of earth sciences at the University of Connecticut, as he discusses the magnificent history in Greater New England stone walls. Before we get started, my role tonight is to go over the basic logistics about this webinar. After that, our Education Director, Julie Hart, will provide a brief introduction to the Duchess Land Conservancy and tonight's presenter. First, you are muted and chat is disabled for this event to ensure that there is no interruption during the presentation. Second, the raise hand function is disabled. If you could enter all questions into the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. You can access the Q&A box at the bottom center of your screen. Questions will be addressed when the presentation is done or by our team during the presentation if possible. If there are a great deal of questions, we'll try to combine them based on topics. Third, closed captioning is enabled for this event. To turn this function on, please select the CC icon located at the bottom of your screen. And finally, I'll hand it over to Julie Hart, our Education Director, who will tell you a bit about the Duchess Land Conservancy, this webinar series, and our guest presenter tonight. Julie.
Thank you, Brian. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Julie Hart, an ecologist and educator here at the Duchess Land Conservancy. I think many of you are probably familiar with the DLC, but for anyone who is not, let me give you a quick overview. The Duchess Land Conservancy is a private nonprofit land conservation organization located in the Hudson Valley of New York State, and we are dedicated to preserving the farms, forests, wetlands and waterways, open spaces, and wildlife habitats of Dutchess County. We are an accredited land trust, and since our founding in 1985, we have worked with hundreds of landowners and protected over 46,000 acres of land. And we want to thank the Molly B. Schaefer Education Fund and Labella Associates for sponsoring this event. We're really excited about our third season of Earth Matters, the DLC's winter webinar series. On the first Wednesday of each month through April, we'll be bringing you a fascinating speaker with lots to teach us. And this season, we're learning about the history and ecology of our own Hudson Valley. I hope that these webinars will help you to see the lands around you in a new way, to read the stories that can be found in the rocks, the waters, and the trees, and to find a new appreciation for this incredible landscape we call home. So tonight I'm really excited to welcome Professor Robert Thorson, who is a professor of earth sciences at the University of Connecticut. Professor Thorson is a Midwestern native who turned into a Northwestern geologist and then a Northeastern academic. His main scholarly interests focus on the physical relationships between humans and their landscapes, especially the interactions of historical archaeology, humans as geophysical and geochemical agents, and environmental history and American literature. He's the author of many wonderful books and has a particular focus on stone walls and also on Walden Pond and Henry David Thoreau. His book, Stone by Stone, was a real eye-opener for me and changed the way I look at that very, very common feature of our Hudson Valley landscape, the stone wall. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Thorson, and he is going to tell us about the magnificent history in Greater New England's stone walls.
And I'm sharing my screen now. Let me know when you get it.
All right.
Have you got it?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, we'll give it a go. First of all, thank you very much, Julie, for that introduction, and to all of you in the audience for coming. It's always a pleasure for me to share what I really like most about New England. I think it's not the lobsters. I think it's the rural interior countryside, and maybe that's a blend of where I've been in my lifetime before I ended up here. So let's see if I can move the slide ahead. Nope. There we go. Down here on the lower left. There we go. So this is my thank you slide. I always put one in so I don't forget that I couldn't be pulling this off without the help on your end, especially for Julie Hart, who's been really an amazing correspondent, and everybody in the audience. Now, one time I gave the wrong talk. I mean, I showed up at an audience of 100 people or so, and I started giving a lecture, and about a third of the way through, they said, "That's not what we expected to hear from you." And so ever since then, I've decided to check the website of wherever I'm going and make sure that I'm giving the right talk, not the wrong talk. And so I started doing the truth in advertising in the advertising, I'm supposed to talk about stone by stone, the magnificent history in Greater New England stone walls. And of course, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So there's no mix up tonight. And in a fair trade, I don't think that I'm receiving anything for this. There's no honorarium, there's no payment. I suggested you just plow it back into the land trust. But I did think of something you could do. And that is that if you're interested, and you haven't read Stone by Stone, there's a new audio. The book got so old that Tantor Media decided it was a classic, and so they brought it out as a classic. And people are listening to it now. And I did narrate it, so that was a plus. But it was only after a couple of the auditions didn't work that well. So I was happy to do that. So it's a fair trade. Just if you're interested, read what you can, listen to what you can, and learn about stone walls. And by the way, that's Lake Dutchess, and I had the pleasure of being on Lake Dutchess for about a week with my sons and grandchildren 2 summers ago. They rented a place there because they live down in Manhattan, so Dutchess is easy to get to. And that was a really wonderful weekend. So I know your country pretty well, and I took a number of hikes in and around that lake. Okay, I want to give a shout out to Susan Alport for writing Sermons in Stone. And what I remembered is when I was getting started on this topic, it was roughly 91, 92. I started thinking about the subject after a year-long seminar at Yale University with William Cronin as a sponsor, and we started talking about environmental history pretty deeply. And I was just about to start writing something on stone walls when this book showed up. And then, of course, I gobbled it right up. I read it, and I thought it was really marvelous because I learned a lot about stone walls that I didn't know, not being a native here. And of course, the writing was just beautiful. But it was also a goad to me to get going because I had a lot of why questions after each of her chapters. Like why is this the case, or why is? And that's my natural instinct as a scientist. So I began looking into the science, really, the soil science and ergonomics and everything else about stone walls. The end result of that, 17 drafts later, was the book Stone by Stone, which was published in 2003, and that's the namesake for this talk tonight. And I had something happen to me yesterday. I got a news update from a colleague, an emeritus professor of history, and said, "Hey, that piece you wrote for the Smithsonian made the best history writing of 2023 for the History News Network." And I said, "Well, that's great. I mean, I had no idea." But I did work really hard on a piece in the Smithsonian that was published last November that tried to summarize a lot of my thoughts about how important stone walls were for the region. And when I say region, I mean Greater New England. To me, New England includes everything to the Hudson River. But I have to say Greater New England for those people that feel like they live on the east side of the Hudson but are not in New England, and that's you guys. But to me, I don't need to say Greater, I just say New England. So I was really pleased by that there's enough interest in that article so I decided to use that article as one of the 3 histories that I'm going to share with you tonight. So this is the outline. And the 3 basic histories are there. Stone by stone, I'm going to go chapter by chapter. And, I'll get it all done in 50 minutes, so don't worry about that. And then I'm going to use the Smithsonian article, which I wrote last November, and I'm going to go through some of the key paragraphs in it, not read them, but just mention how that thing is structured because it lays out something different about the stone walls. And then thirdly, jasper. That's a mineral coating a rock, and I'm going to be showing that to you. That's a whole nother history that ties back to my first book on stone walls, which is Stonewall Secrets, co-authored with my wife and illustrated by Gustav Moore. That, ironically and coincidentally, was a Smithsonian notable book in 1998 for children, and it was our first stab at this. So we're really, really happy about that. And the stone you're looking at is simply a quartz cobblestone cemented or mortared into the wall of a very bizarre and unusual little building on the Yukon campus. That's the University of Connecticut campus. And I'm really working that up, as a local site where we can get really earthy and learn something. In that pavilion, it's a stone pavilion. Inside is a beautiful specimen stone of every state in the Union, and it was built in 1937. So when you see that, the point is, it is in a stone wall. And when you see it, it just means I'm going to the next part of the talk, sort of like a commercial break. But before my 3 histories, I want to do 2 things. One is I want to talk a little bit about Greater New England. And then secondly, I want to just make the case that stone walls are the signature landform of New England. Then after my 3 quick histories, we'll go towards a stonewall science, depending on how much time we have. I can get into that forever, but I just want to make a few points before I open it up to questions. So we'll move on. And there you go. That's the first break here. Greater New England. Now we move on. Okay, this is an American Impressionist painting, in this case from Old Lyme, Connecticut, but it could be anywhere in Greater New England. You have these scenes, and it's not just the scene itself, as in a photograph, but the evocation, of the landscape that comes there. And I think this scene could be painted just about anywhere in Greater New England. Now, let's look to the left. This is an old Rand McNally style map, and I use it on purpose. If you look at New York, you'll see that big blob of red. You go straight up, that's the Hudson Champlain Valley. And as you know, it goes straight north-south, right, all the way up to the St. Lawrence. Then the St. Lawrence goes out, to the embayment of the St. Lawrence, the Cape of the Bay of St. Lawrence. But Maine and New Brunswick are carved off separately up there. And there is the St. Johns River that divides New England naturally from everywhere else. My point is that's a block of landforms. That's a landscape. That's an old mountain route. That's a coherent geological region, that is very, very distinctive. All right. And that's the edge of New England, is the St. Lawrence, Champlain, Hudson River Valley, especially to a geologist who moved here from Alaska. And on the right, you'll see a bedrock map. And on that bedrock map, you don't have to read the little zonations. But the key idea is those are all different grades and terrains and kinds of rock. The red rock on the edge is the stuff the Adirondacks is made of. It's that old, ancient, stable craton of North America. And everything else was sandwiched or squeezed onto it, during the mountain building episode called the Acadian. So all of that stuff is the same rock, and there's no difference between Westchester and parts of Vermont or parts of Western Connecticut. It's all the same rock. I didn't dig out a geologic map of New York, but you can trust me. So to all geologists, New England's a unified region east of the Hudson-St. Lawrence lowland. And without the details of the rock, it's an exhumed mountain route. And what I mean by exhumed is that the mountains used to be higher than the Himalayas. They were maybe not higher, but as high. They were about as high as they could possibly get. This was a colossal mountain range. And like all mountain ranges, it has high glaciated peaks at the top, real rough topography. But down below, at a depth of maybe 20 kilometers, that's a deep distance, straight down 20 kilometers, you have all kinds of hard rock that's recrystallizing in the mountain route. And what happened is, since then, so much of the land has eroded. We've lost about, maybe at least 15 kilometers, vertical kilometers of rock to give us the rocks that used to be down in that mountain route. So that's what New England is made of. It's the mountain route, of an old system that has mostly eroded away, but not completely. And for comparison, I consider Minnesota my home state, and it has 87,000 square miles. All right. Now, all of New England, not counting the part of Vermont and Maine and New Hampshire that hardly anybody ever sees, is smaller than that. It's 72,000 miles. So if you find the deficit there of 15,000 miles, that's about what you could get, by adding in all of the stuff east of the Hudson River. To make New England be the same size as Minnesota. The thing that's dramatic is that all of New England has got 6 states in it. And, it's smaller than Minnesota, which is not even a huge state. It's just a good sized state. And that's kind of my perspective. And I moved from Alaska, and all of New England is 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the state I moved from. Now, I wonder, where's the epicenter of this stonewall phenomenon? So what I try to do is take a circle, and I said, well, Nantucket, that is Stonewall's there. So I want to make sure to include that, in Outer Cape Cod. And certainly Staten Island down there, parts of northern New Jersey, I want that. And certainly much of New Hampshire and Vermont, I want that. And so I draw a circle around that epicenter, or draw a circle to take in all of that country. There's a lot of Stonewalls in southern Maine, but not very many in northern and eastern Maine. And if you draw that circle, then the center of that circle, the red dot, is the epicenter of the phenomenon. It doesn't mean that it's the only, it's the highest concentration, but it's the center of the phenomenon that is mostly inscribed by that circle. And if you do that, I think you can see that all of Westchester lies within that circle. And in fact, you're closer to the center of that red circle than many places, in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut that are better known for their stone walls. So you're right in there. You got the right rocks, you got the right terrain, you got the right glacial setting, you got the right, people, you got the right everything to build that. So that's just something I wanted to point out. So Greater New England to me is anything east of the Hudson, St. Lawrence lowland. And now the signature landform. This is a uncredited image from Block Island. We don't know the photographer, but it was taken about 1880 from Beacon Hill. And I think you'll notice it's just stone walls everywhere on Block Island. And on the right, you'll see the tallest hotel. I etched it out in lining. And on the left, you'll see the pier. Now, I went to this same exact place and I took a picture where I could see the tallest hotel building and the end of the pier. And it's almost all covered with oak scrub forest. So this is the nature of the thing that lies below the forest that is being revealed by all of our new LiDAR studies. This is Block Island, a place where after a century, they were burning peat because there wasn't a single tree left, I think, to burn. So let me talk about what I mean by a signature landform. I mean something that defines the area. And so I'm going to do a quick reading right out of the introductory page of Stone by Stone to make my point. Oh, that's the acknowledgements. Here it is. There are old stone walls elsewhere, but only in New England do they rise above the level of architectural ornaments to the status of landforms. Kentucky has its caves, Florida its coral reefs, Louisiana its bayous, Arizona its arroyos, Washington its volcanoes, Minnesota its lakes, and New England its stone walls. The landscape would simply not be the same without them. That's what I mean by a signature landform, and also something that is sort of distinctive of the region that isn't shared by other regions. And the reason for this is threefold. In order to have that phenomenon, you have to have three things come together. If you lose one, you won't have the phenomenon. So it's like a Venn diagram. The first thing you need is hard rocks, hard crystalline rocks like granite, or gneiss or quartzite. If you have hard rocks, the glacier, incorporates them and crushes them, but not completely. They don't just fall apart like sandstone. If you have sandstone, the same glacier in the same circumstance pick up that rock and it's instantly crushed back to the sand that it was originally from. The second thing you need are glacial bottom soils, or till, if you know that word. If you have glacier bottom soils, you're taking that incorporated rock and you're smearing it all over the landscape as the glacier glides by. And if you have non-glacial soils, yes, you can have concentrations of stone, but they are not expansive in the same way they are. So you'll have localized stone walls up and down the Appalachians, but they quickly disappear because you're not looking at a regional geological process like the bottom of an ice sheet. And third thing you need is a farm culture, or what I call a livestock tillage culture, what some people call animal husbandry. But the key idea is you need lots of fences because you've got livestock and tillage and pasture and woodlot and sugar bush and all of these things that you need to separate from one another. And if you don't have the need for lots of fences, the odds of having stone walls go way down. So if you were to drive from Boston to Buffalo on back roads, you would see stone walls everywhere in the rural countryside. But as soon as you get to the Hudson River, you climb it, you go on the other side, and the stone walls pretty much disappear on the flats of upstate New York. And that's not because there weren't glaciers there. And it's not because there weren't, New Englanders that moved west and did exactly the same thing with a farm culture. But what happened was they did not have hard rocks. They were crushed by the ice sheet. Now, if you go from Fairfield County, Connecticut, for example, there's just stone walls everywhere, and you drive through the Big Apple on the other side of Staten Island, and you keep going into New Jersey, pretty soon you're going to disappear stone walls. And you've still got hard rocks at depth, right? And you've still got, the livestock farm culture, but what you're missing is the glacial bottom soils. So you don't have walls. And thirdly, if you go to southern Maine, there's stone walls all over the place, especially from the dairy farming prior to the 1930s. But if you go north, up into the woods country, into the lakes country, they disappear. And yes, you've got the right rocks, and yes, you've got the right glacial soil, but you're missing that livestock tillage culture. Instead, you have a woodland culture. And so when you have all three of those factors in place, you're going to get stone walls. In fact, it's really hard to avoid them. And in New England, the key idea is not to explain the presence of a stone wall, it's to say, how come there are no walls around here? Everywhere else in the country, you see stone walls, and there'll be a pocket here and there. You'll say, why are stone walls here? So the question is different. Outside of New England, the question is why are there no stone walls here? Whereas in the outside are, why do we have stone walls in this particular place? That's a key factor that I left out of Stone by Stone when I wrote it. I just wanted to make sure. That's why they're the signature landform. And now, my first of three versions of history. It's going to be the one that ties together with Stone by Stone, the book. And of course, I can't go through the whole thing, so I'll just do a little bit of it. I'll look at it chapter by chapter. So what I tried to do was match the color and go chapter by chapter instead of stone by stone. And these are the 10 chapters off on the right. And I'll say a few things about each one before I elaborate a little bit. Oh, and by the way, that's the copy of the book that's sitting in front of me. It was the one that put on the Connecticut Book Award, Best Nonfiction Award. And it completely wore off from overuse. And I've taped up the book so many times I can hardly believe it. And I've worn it all off. I've carried that book for a lot of talks, and I haven't left it anywhere since. So let's go back to the 10 chapters. First of all, Old and New England. What I mean here is that we often hear how different New England was from Old England, but from my point of view, there's a lot of similarities. They're both glaciated mountain roots. In fact, they have much the same rock. And I'm talking about, sort of central New England and north of Britain. It's in Ireland and all that. There's much the same rock up there because it used to be part of the same mountain system. So the rock was familiar, the landscape was familiar, glaciation was familiar. And of course, it's a semi-maritime environment. So that was familiar for the coast of New England, where the first century of settlement took place throughout New England. So I think it made it easier to settle here. Second chapter, making the stone. In order to have a stone wall, you have to make the stone. And to make the stone, you need to have rock. And rock and stone are not the same thing. Rock is the raw material. Stone is the object made from that raw material. You go into a rock quarry and you take stone out. Okay? So stone is a piece or a fragment. And to make the stone, you first have to make the rock deep in a mountain root. And then what you have to do is, as you erode off those kilometer after kilometer of the Earth's crust, the buoyant rock below rises. And when it rises, it cools and it expands. And it's under a stress regime, a compressive stress regime when this happens, and it ends up fracturing. So you drive by a road cut, any road cut anywhere, you're going to see, you don't see one solid mass of rock. Almost always what you see are a fragmented mass of rock. And so what the glacier is essentially doing is picking up those fragments of rock that are created by the expansion and contraction tensile forces that are within the Earth's crust during that exhumation. Okay, once you make the stone, you bury it. Now, when the ice sheets left here, it was pretty much a moonscape, just rubble and rock everywhere without a single plant. At least in the first few hundred years, prior to about 15,000 years ago, which means we had 3,000 or 4,000 years of quite cold, windy, blowing tundra conditions. We didn't have much vegetation. But when vegetation began around 15,000 years ago, we had about 14,000 years worth of progressive burial of whatever stone was there. And it's not fast, but if you have enough time, you can bury it. And so much of the stone in New England was buried at least to a depth below the sod or the mulch, and certainly below the A horizon in many cases, but not all. And then often below about 20 centimeters or more of loamy soil material that's essentially biologically created. So there are many processes taking place within a rooted forest soil that will cause fine-grained materials to rise upward and coarse-grained materials to settle downward. There's half of a chapter about that in the book, if you like. But the net idea is that 15,000 years worth of soil formation did a lot of stone burial. This doesn't mean there weren't places that were totally stony, even in their primeval condition, or that there wasn't, patches of stone immediately below the surface. It just meant that in general, the stone was buried below a forest soil when people arrived here. It was not a moonscape. Next chapter is taking the forest. And you're not just cutting the trees. If you just cut the trees and let them grow back, there wouldn't have been much of a thing. But what you did is you strip away the forest soil and replace it, with a mineral soil that is losing biomatter as you haul it off in the form of cattle or sheep or hogs or whatever you're raising there. So there's a loss of biological matter, organic matter within the soil. There's a compaction from animal hoofs. There's a greater exposure to cold winds. There's less snow cover. There's essentially a deeper frost zone. And all of these factors add up to basically change the microclimate of the soil, such that more of a boreal or subarctic phenomenon was taking place, especially during the Little Ice Age. And that heaved up a lot of stone that had been buried before. Now, the next chapter is copious stone. It just deals this process. And basically what's happening is that once you remove that protective cover of the mulch, you're getting lots and lots of stone. And it comes up fairly, slowly, but then it really peaks and accumulates. And when the Europeans visited here, they said, my gosh, why would you abandon your fields just before the stone is pretty much done coming up? So there was a load of stone to ambush from below that came up and surprised a lot of people. I'm not saying there wasn't stone to begin with in many places, but in a lot of places, there was more stone than was expected. Okay, and then building walls. Once that stone is there, what do you do with it? Well, there's lots you do with it. You can pile it up in stones, you can shuffle it sideways, but essentially the edges of the fields were magnets. There were magnets for accumulating stone because there's already a fence there. That's preempted space. You can't use it, so why not just pitch a stone under it? And if you do this for a generation, and if you were throwing, rotten pumpkins on your fence lines, you'd come back the next year and that rotten pumpkin would be gone. But if you throw a boulder of granite there and you come back the next year, it's still there. And so every year you kept adding more and more stone, and then eventually you had something, you had enough to do something with it. You can't do much with a nickel, but you can do a lot with 1 billion nickels. Or 1 million nickels. And that's essentially the same phenomenon. And I'm generalizing greatly here because, sometimes people just build border walls straight out, because they want them. But generally speaking, and again, we don't have really good statistics, we're working on that. I'm guessing that the generic New England wall is essentially a stack of stones done to get the stones taking up less space than a sprawling pile. And it's on a former fence line where previous stone accumulated. And that's just kind of a message on building walls. Then you can build them really nicely, or you can build them slovenly, but there's all kinds of things that go on with building walls. And Susan Alport's book is really particularly good on this part. And then land abandoned. I want you to think of the settling of New England more like a wave, a slow wave, than a sort of like an immigration that stayed. Because what happened was people really didn't move into the rural countryside until, at least not in great numbers, until the 18th century. Certainly after the Revolutionary War, it really picked up. But about the time of the Erie Canal and the steamship and all of these other factors, the rural agriculture that wasn't near the big cities really began to suffer. The economy went pretty much downhill. Even though the soils were still good. People are not leaving because the soils are terrible. They're just leaving because it's just not the cultural choice that they're making. And part of that has to do with the incredible urbanization and the desire to go west. So a lot of walls were built, and then land was abandoned, and it was reforested. And then rural revival. The Model T really made a difference. Once you got wheels, you were able to go back to places that may have been abandoned a century before, and lots of people were buying old properties and moving into them and beginning to own them. They were accessible and they were dirt cheap. And so there was a rural revival where people sort of moved back into the countryside, beginning with the automobile. And then, of course, that picked up again when we got to the sort of the so-called conservation movement and the environmental movement, of the 20th century. There was a real potent tendency to reoccupy rural areas. And much of New England is what I call ruburbia, which is a contraction of suburbia and rural. Real rural is like North Dakota. where you're, at least a half an hour from the nearest 4-lane highway, if not 3 hours from the nearest 4-lane highway. And in Connecticut, where I live 15 minutes from the nearest 4-lane highway, and that's a lot. That's a lot compared to most of the population. And New England is crisscrossed by 4-lane highways. So I think you get my point there. And then the last 2 chapters are where we start drawing meaning from the stone walls. And Back to Nature has the thesis that stone walls are essentially the result of human ecology. And they kind of had to be built, and human beings were sort of the mechanical agents that made them be built, given their commitment to a livestock tillage culture. And the last one is drawing meaning from stone. What does it all mean? Why did they do it? Why do we like stone? Why do we appreciate stone walls? And why should we conserve them why should we conserve them? So that's it in 10 chapters. That's a very, very brief abstract of the book. And I didn't plan to spend this much time on that slide, but that's just the way it came out. Okay, now novelty by novelty. Mine was not the first book on stone walls. It's certainly not an expansive one. It's certainly monographic scale, but it did have some novel explanations in it that I wasn't able to find anywhere else. And one was this idea of the sensitive changes in the soil physics, that basically helped increase or enhance the stoniness of the surface soil. It's not just taking off the sod and having the cattle make them. Basically, the stones are the environmental impact, an unforeseen environmental impact of the way of life that they led. In the same way that carbon emissions to the atmosphere are sort of an unanticipated environmental impact of just the way we run our lives. Now, I speak only for the first century. The last century, it's been clear. Linear landfills, that's a term that I used that my editor really liked. The idea is that the most fundamental purpose of a stone wall is to hold stone. And yes, you can build a nice fence out of it, but most of them are not as high as fences. And yes, you can mark a nice boundary out of it. And yes, you can use it for exercise. And yes, you can do folk art in stone. And yes, you can impress your neighbors, with a nice looking architectural stone wall. And all of those are true. But the most fundamental sine qua non about stone walls is you need a place to put the stones. The third, the human ecology. I think we've greatly exaggerated, the hard scrabble farmer, eking out a living, and New England is just terrible, stony, rocky, virtually uninhabitable. And I think we did that in parallel to the Western cowboy. And the Western cowboy basically goes like this. You need and I'm talking about the 1950s and the 20th century, is that you need in all the cowboy movies that I watched when I was a kid, in the 50s, you need a macho man, which is the cowboy, and you need an animal companion, which is the horse, and you need an enemy. And you know what those enemies are: other outlaws or the indigenous peoples that were there. So we kind of had that whole story out west of a great, but it turns out cowboys were trivial to the economic importance of the country. They were only a couple of decades that they were important, and only in the Southern High Plains were they really important. So we've taken something that is really quite trivial in terms of the history of our country and made it enormous, such that it was the be all end all. And I think we did something similar to that in New England, where we turned the stones into the enemies that we could conquer with the ox and the macho farmer, that looked something like the Lexington statue. So that's just a thesis that is really untested, but it makes a lot of sense to me why people think that New England is so terrible in its soils and so stony. I think we like the idea that we survived that. And then the other one is the reverence for stone. I'm not the first one to reverence stone. I mean, it goes all the way back to, the Bronze Age books of Exodus, that talk about stone. You should preserve it and revere it. But I just have a lot to say about the reverence for stone in that last chapter. And some of it was unique. So those are, I think, the novelties in that book that built on the work of others. And then epic by epic, there's a geologic story that I suggested earlier. This is a map. The purple is the continent of Avalonia, the mini continent that got smashed between Africa, here labeled Gondwanaland, and Laurentia, which is the ancestral North America. And so what you look at is right about there on where the first question mark on the left is about where New England is. It's just a great big smush that makes that mountain system. And this activity took place between 375 and 325 million years ago, plus or minus. And it's called the Acadian Mountains. They're just not there anymore. But that was the name of the mountain range that used to be. So the ancient epoch, we got to make the rock and we got to make the fragments. During the Pleistocene epoch or the Ice Age epoch, you have to bring on the ice sheets from Canada. And after that, you have a transitional phase of 4,000 or 5,000 years where things are quite tundra-like and you're really, increasing the stoniness of some soils. But then you get to the Holocene or the present interglacial, and you're burying that stone. And then there's a wave of settlement that goes over the landscape, which I will detail on the next page. And then in the wake of that wave, we'll find some settlement. And now in the Anthropocene, that is the 20th and the 21st century, the epoch where human works are writ large. Our task is to manage the stone and share what we know, and preserve our stone walls. So this is a little bit heavy, but this is the cascade of events that really happen when you cleared a field. First, when you clear the field, you have a disequilibrium surface. Hasn't been there for 15,000 years. So there's all kinds of differences. Then when you farm it, you're doing compaction, freezing, thermal conductivity of the soil changes, infiltration changes, and you get sheet erosion that you haven't had for years before. And then when you're fractionating that stone, the stone is rising up, you're sorting it. You're putting some in piles, you're moving some to the house site, but most of them go to the walls. And those are the one-handers that you can just handle, or the two-handers you can heft by yourself by balancing them on your thighs. And then you dispose them, hauling, dragging, sledding, building fences, piles, packing corners. There's a detail that we don't need to get into. And then using that stone to making walls and laying good boundaries and so forth. So there's a whole wave of things that happen, and each of those precedes the previous one. And then when everybody walks away and you abandon the field, the woodland ecosystem comes back. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, as Frost said, the patina, the staining, the unraveling, the falling, the burial, the tree caving in, all of the things that are taking walls apart before some of them were rebuilt. And then finally reclaiming them. We're reclaiming walls, in Reburbia. And we strip mined a lot of them and we buried a lot of them. Probably only half of them are still around. But we're also rebuilding them from the bottom up and repairing them from the top down. Now what's our task? I am trying to really promote the science of stone walls. I published an article, a peer-reviewed journal article about half a year ago on really the classification and taxonomy of stone walls. And I'll be happy to send that link to anyone who wants it. It's a peer-reviewed mini monograph on how to define and manage stone walls. And I have a paper in review at the Journal of Public History, which is basically full of recommendations on how to inventory and characterize stone walls if you were a land trust or a town or a private landowner or whatever. And then finally, part of management is always regulations. As much as we hate regulations, they are necessary. And that really will be up to the local towns to decide. I've been privy to some of these. I've helped, I've involved myself in some regulations, but mostly I stay away from that because it's really about individual towns doing what they want or need to do. The goal, of course, is to save our stone walls before they all disappear so they can be, modified on public lands so that we can educate people about them and use them. They're amazing resources for education of all ages. There's beauty, there's math, there's science, there's geology, there's ecology, there's all kinds of phenomenon in addition to the history. And this all points all focuses on building better communities. Okay, now I think I'm moving rapidly along. I don't know what my timeline is. I'll check. There it is. It's 6:41. I think I'm doing okay. There was a near miss. In 1939, the U.S. Bureau of Mines, Oliver Bowles, he was really looking at a way to improve the roads all over New England. And he thought, the stone walls, what a perfect idea. So he was the one that really tipped me off, because he used the agricultural census offenses to try and estimate how much stone wall is there to be just picked up and turned into roadbed. And here's an astonishing picture on the left. Both of them are astonishing. This is just the rock crusher in Stamford, Connecticut. So many walls were just fed into those things and crushed for roadbed. And on the right, this is actually a stone wall that was dismantled and laid down for subgrade for a road in White Mountain National Forest, courtesy of the New Hampshire Geological Survey. It's just hard to believe you'd take a wall apart and lay it down and then put tar over it and drive it, but that's what was happening. All right, so moving rapidly along. Now, another way to look at the same history, an article that I published in Smithsonian last year, is getting a lot of interest. All of the photographs that I'm going to show you are from that article, pulled mostly their Getty images. But here's just this is the cover image for it, and this is the takeaway line. You know, when you click the website, this is what it says. Quote, originally built as barriers between fields and farms, the region's abandoned farmstead walls have since become the binding threads of its regional cultural fabric. Now, there's a lot of metaphors in there and analogies, but I think it's really, there are two key ideas in this article, and it lays it out. It's almost 3,000 words long. They increased it by 500. I couldn't believe it. You know, they really wanted to expand it out to make it almost like a story in and of itself. But the idea is that these walls come up as barriers between fields and farms, and then they're abandoned. And we know what Robert Frost thought. You know, he thought, you know, something there is that doesn't love a wall that wants it down. You know, that's really him. You know, and he blamed Frostheave for that. But, you know, that's only because his name was Frost. The number one killer of walls are trees, growing things, roots and vines and limbs, those kinds of things. But nevertheless, the walls are abandoned. But since they were abandoned and since we're on the other side of that and we're recovering them, they're artifacts, you know, and these artifacts are not just here and there. They connect, and they connect all over the region. And they are the binding threads of what I think is a regional cultural fabric, especially away from the coast. You know, it's that rural New England environment. And I will say that things like sugar maples, you know, the New Englanders moved west all the way to Minnesota. When Henry Thoreau was there in the 1861, he said all of the men who were timbering were from Maine. And he said half of the men I met in Minneapolis were from Massachusetts. And New England just went west all the way to the prairies, you know, and did their thing. So there are sugar maples, and there are, you know, church steeples, you know, and there are town greens, and there are all these normal New England things that go west with those New Englanders. But guess what? No stone walls, because you leave the mountain route of New England and you head west into the platform, the flat-lying sedimentary rocks of much of the world. So they have become the binding threads of our regional cultural fabric because they connect us all together. The walls in Vermont and the walls in New Hampshire really don't look that different, you know, but politically, those are very different places. And so those walls really do help ameliorate any difficulties. And then, of course, on the other side, you've got New York and Vermont, and the walls look similar. So they really do help bind us together. That's a thesis. That's the thesis of that whole piece. And then here are some of this is the basic narrative of it. And I know it's too much text, but I'm just going to walk through it. First of all, I'm driving into Robert Frost's farm in Derry, New Hampshire. I can hear the crunch of gravel on the driveway. And then I talk about Mending Wall, the poem, you know, in 1914. I mean, Frost really nailed it. You know, do we want them up or do we want them down? Do we like our walls or do we not like our walls? And he nailed that in 1914. And in 1962, he was asked by President Kennedy to go, you know, visit, Khrushchev in the Soviet Union to ameliorate those Cold War tensions, saying we really don't need these boundaries. Well, it didn't work out, but at least we haven't had, you know what, yet. And yes, we all need boundaries. You like to shut your door. You like to maintain your wall on the edge of the property. You know, I like to have downtime for myself. We all need boundaries. You know, but they eventually come apart, especially when they're outside. They just have to. That's thermodynamics. Then I go into the origin of walls. How did they happen? Well, that's the basic story that I've just told you. And then the destruction of stone walls. I talked about that too. But this time I'm saying if we all walked away, the walls would disintegrate and go back to where they came from and spread out. And climate change is probably increasing the rate of wall decay. Although we have less frost heave, we have more of the other things that will help pull a wall apart. Then I do a little literary analysis. Yeah, Mending Wall, the poem, you know, it conflates two key items. You know, the territorialism of, good fences make good neighbors. And then the entropy of, you have to cast a spell to keep the stones from falling all over the place and making them balance. Those two ideas are conflated actually from separate walls. So the poem is really about two walls conflated together, but the poem is, of course, singular, mending wall. And then Frost's whole oeuvre, his whole body of work, I think he wants them down as walls, so they're not barriers to people, but he wants to keep them up as artifacts. We really need those to tie back to the past, and I think he nailed that. And then just two more points, okay? Near the end of the essay, I talk about how they're signifying signature landforms, they're unifying threads. I've already talked to you about that. And then finally, to avoid wanton destruction. And so I end with a modified quote of his. I don't say something there is that doesn't love a wall. I say there's something there is that wants a wall up, not down. And I think that's kind of the way it ends. And so the key message that I pulled from the essay, and this is a quote, is the story of stone walling is nearly the same in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York east of the Hudson River. The unity of New England stone fabric pays no attention to state boundaries, but perfect attention to the regional geology. Noticeable differences here and there, of course, are real, but they're governed mainly by the details of the bedrock and the glacial stories, rather than by differences in political identity or cultural history. I think that's an important message. This is a publicly available article. And now one final history, a real quick one, Jasper. The first book that we published on stone walls was 1998, and we say scattered throughout New England, there are thousands of stone walls crisscrossing woods and fields as if they'd been there forever. This whole book is meant to be read aloud, to kids. And then at the end of the book, it says the walls were there like a library stacked high with earthen books. Each stone contained a story of time and place now gone. Well, this is Jasper. This is not paint on a stone. This is a hydrothermal mineral precipitate, cryptocrystalline quartz stained red by hematite. It's a mineral known as jasper. And it painted the edge of that stone when it was part of the volcanic New England, 200 million years ago. And it got picked up with stones to build a wall, just like Robert Frost would talk about. And in this little scene are a number of different kinds of rocks, each one with a different history. Finally, establishing stonewall science. I'm just going to click through a couple of slides. I'm done with the history now. The key thing is that the walls in the woods that you might look at, they're an independent source of historical documents. They're available to be seen in parks and land trusts. It's an authentic experience to touch history. It's a document, literally, that's written in stone. That if you know what you're doing, you can interpret what that thing is and why it's there, because almost all walls have no documentation for them. And of course, they're viscerally evocative, or you wouldn't have asked me to talk to you about them, and they're durable. How different is that from the normal historical documents seen on the upper right there, that are not available except from certain people. They're always vaulted. You need permissions and justifications. These aren't direct. You have to interpret what's there, and the things are falling apart in the archive anyway, no matter what we try and do. So one good reason to do a science of stone walls is it will allow us, if we have the right taxonomy and terminology and protocols, it will allow us to have an independent source of information about what happened in this or that town that may not be part of public documents. Now, in 2005, I published a book exploring stone walls. It's out of print because Bloomsbury bought my publisher and just decided to let it go. And there's a lot in this book. It's a little bit like a textbook on terminology for stone walls, but it goes into all the basic things of science, geometry, symmetry, segments, age, size, shape, position, order. A lot of these are in that available article that I mentioned, published in Historic Archaeology, a peer-reviewed mini monograph. So this is something to think about, including a definition. And this is the new paper. And the definitions, nomenclatures, and protocols for studying walls, it's now been peer-reviewed and it's in press, and it's being used and cited. Habitats. If you look at the slide on the right, you'll see it's all ferns behind the wall, and it's pretty much flowers and poppies and grass on this side. Walls really do bound different habitats, and walls are habitats themselves. If you go to the website for the Stonewall Initiative, I've got a bobcat photo up there taken by my brother-in-law in Lee, New Hampshire. It's just so clear that the wall is part of the bobcat's hunting style and habitat. If you look at the left one there, it's a nice cover of David Foster's book, Thoreau Country. You'll see the walls are pretty much concentrated in one area. All right. And they are dominant in that zone, not on the highest, smoothest hills, and not on the low alluvial lands, but in the midpoint, we have a whole different habitat at the regional zone that we don't have on the top of the hill or on the bottom. So they're important, a really important part of the habitat. And I'm pushing this idea that there's a parallel with wetlands. If you consider stone walls dry lands, okay, and you change one word in the EPA definitions of functions and values, this is what it is. I can write it for stone walls. Long regarded as wastelands, stone walls or dry lands are now recognized as important features in the landscape that provide numerous beneficial services for people and for fish and wildlife. I would say not fish. In some cases, yes, but most cases, no, but certainly for wildlife. So there's a parallel that I'm trying to push. If you're going to map and manage your wetlands and get it into policy, why not do the same thing with your dry lands? That's it. We made it. Thanks. And I'm going to check the time and pat myself on the back for finishing by 6:53. So there you have it. It's a pleasure talking with you. I hope some of it made sense.
Thank you very much. That was so wonderful. I learned a lot. So I've been taking notes as we go along on a number of the resources that you mentioned in the books, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who registered. So we'll have a list of all those resources and, of course, a link to the recording of tonight's webinar. And I think a lot of people are going to be interested in that peer-reviewed article that you mentioned.
Yeah, good.
If you could send me a link for that, I can include it in
sure.
that email.
Sure.
All right, so we have a bunch of questions in Q&A already. Keep them coming. Type in your questions anytime. Before we begin, I wanted to let you all know that next month, on Wednesday, March 6th, our next Earth Matters speaker will be Will Tatum, our very own Dutchess County historian. And he is going to talk about the palimpsest of land use, reading the landscape as a historical source. So you've got a whole month to look up the word palimpsest. So we hope to see you there in March, and let's get started on the Q&A. All right. So the first question, have you ever looked at the stone walls built by the Shakers and their New England communities? Did they build walls for certain reasons, and how did they build them, and how they built them, and what are their enduring qualities?
Well, yes, I have looked at them in some of the Shaker villages. And I'll just say that in most of them, they just looked like nice, simple, well-built walls. And I don't really have any notes or specific photographs on how Shakers built walls separate from others. There was a Shaker community in Harvard, Mass. That I will bring up. It's a small town of Harvard, Mass., not to be confused with the university. And there are some extraordinary, barn walls and foundation walls on that property. So it was a Shaker village. But there was one thing else too that I found really interesting. And it was a beautiful house foundation full of stone. It was like an old barn made basically of stone, most of which had fallen down. And I just assumed that we're on a Shaker village here. This is a Shaker property, and all the other walls are Shaker built, that house would be. And it turns out that I was giving a talk talking about the Shaker, building this beautiful stone building. And the person in the audience got up and said, I actually own that property, and I have carefully researched it. It's a public accessible property. And she said, it turns out that the Shakers subcontracted to the Irish to build that particular foundation. And so I was surprised by that. Never take anything for granted. I hope it's true, but that's what I was told by the owner of the property. So I believe it. Yeah, the beautiful walls, massive walls in some places, 2 or 3 places, but I don't have specific notes on them.
I live near a Shaker village, and I've noticed their stone wall structures are magnificent.
Yeah.
Okay,
They
next
were
question.
magnificent in that one place, and I've seen them in 2 or 3 villages.
Yep.
Sabbath Day Lake, somewhere in Maine, and somewhere in Hancock, New Hampshire. I forget.
Yeah. All All right, next question. Thank you for that. And next question coming in is, do you have any suggestions or how or why stone walls can be preserved? So the how and why of
Yes.
stone wall preservation.
Yes. First of all, the why, and this is in the document that I mentioned. I've submitted an article to the public historian. It's in review. I don't know whether they will publish it or not, but I'm circulating a preprint, for organizations, but not necessarily letting it all fly because they need to have the rights to publish that. But there's a real simple rule of thumb. I think we should. I think we should preserve as many walls as we can without being completely, insane about the regulations. And there are two basic kinds, if you want to be really simple about it. One kind is out in the woods. It's got a closed canopy forest. It's just part of the rural landscape. It's in the middle of one of your land trust properties, and it's not connected to a road or someone's house and so forth. If you understand what I'm getting at there, that's the normal wall, and I think the dominant wall. And I think that wall is busy being archaeology. It's doing something. It's busy being archaeology, so let it be there. And I like to think of it as a clock or a calendar where we can kind of count the passage of time at the millennial scale, not at the century scale and not at the decade or yearly scale. In other words, it really slows us down to think of a wall, being there and slowly coming apart. There's also a wonderful sort of semi-spiritual message there of nature reclaiming the stones, that we've assembled in our own way. And so I would argue that a stone wall in the woods, that is sort of nature is taking it apart, is even more beautiful than a wall that is recently built. And that's because there's that message of resilience and that message of what's that word, reclaiming, redemption. There's a message of redemption there. So those are the walls that are in the woods, and that's my recommendation: is to the extent possible, preserve them. Do not strip mine them. I wrote a New York Times opinion piece, an invited piece on that, and they just titled it "Strip Mining History." It's just, yes, it's good business. I've been solicited 3 times to sell the stone walls on a 4-acre property that I had, by stonemasons that just want to ship it out west. And just don't do that, please. I mean, it's legal. You need a permit to go in there and take out some sand or to go in there and cross a wetland, but you don't need a permit to strip mine all the stone walls on your property. It's just silly, to me. So the second kind of wall are publicly viewed walls. These are on roadsides, or they're on maintained trails, or they're associated with historic properties of some sort or another, and these have to be maintained. I think the person who built them would want them maintained. The person who built that and was proud of that wall on a roadside or something would probably want it to be maintained. And how do you do that is tricky. That depends on your budget. It depends on your willingness to use pesticides, herbicides. It depends on your willingness to get a crew of teenagers together, who need work. All those things that I can't decide, but which a land trust executive could decide or a town manager could decide. But the basic idea is you maintain them, and you do so safely, and you do so judiciously, and you stabilize the ones that you can. But we need to be able to see the walls on our roadsides and on our trail sides, and we need to see them, I think, in decent shape. Otherwise, they become dangerous, or people will think they're derelict, so they'll take them apart. If somebody sees a wall that's well maintained, they're less likely to go up and harvest a truckload of it. Than if one is just sort of falling apart. So that's a real dichotomy. And the third walls that I think should be, showed and maintained are the ones that people build for themselves because they love to do it. If you have a wall in the intermediate state, like the one in the picture here, that was part of the Smithsonian piece, you can see on the very left that that's a laid wall, the original look, and it's kind of come apart. I'm okay with the wall looking the way it does. I wouldn't want to see the whole thing be redone, but I don't think the whole thing should be falling apart. And it's not me to say what to do. I have no legal clout. I have no financial investment. I have no political connections anywhere. I just can react to what I think. And I think that people who are upgrading stone walls that are visible, should be, free to do that, and not restricted. But in a closed canopy forest, I feel different. And I feel very different for a farm in business. It's been in business forever. And, coming from a farm background myself, if that farmer wants to do what they want to do with their wall, I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that because otherwise you're infringing on that basic, property rights of farmers. It gets tricky, of course. So I've given some thought to this, and I don't go very deep into the politics, but I've tried to share a little bit there for you. I hope that's okay.
Yes, thank you very much. That was a complex answer to a complex
Yeah,
issue.
I've written
Yeah.
it all down, and I'll send it to you, but we'll see who publishes it. And these are just like I was giving a talk for a land trust in Eastern Connecticut, and they asked me to start thinking about this, and so I actually, oh, what the heck, so I spent a morning sitting down just writing basic principles, and I ended up with a manuscript that I thought I should submit somewhere, and I've shared with a few land trusts. So, as long as it's not distributed, you're welcome to use it for what I consider a legitimate pre-print or pre-publication because it's been submitted.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a great resource.
And that puts it in a different category. It's not an exciting article because it's, a description of sort of principles and recommendations and policies for inventory and management. But what it all comes down to is if you're going to start managing stone walls, you need a language. You need a definition. I didn't get into this in my talk because it's like a bottomless hole. But if you, I had Concord, Massachusetts ask me last year, what's a stone wall? For God's sakes, if Concord, Mass needs to ask me what a stone wall is, what's going on? And the reason is because their historic preservation group, is not in agreement with their public utilities group. Those are two very different and very realistic and very important sides of town government, and they have different definitions of stone walls. So mine is really simple, and it's not simple at all, because this may sound a little crazy, but defining stone walls is a lot like defining pornography. Everybody knows what it is when you look at it. Oh, yeah, that's a stone wall. But it really is hard to define explicitly. And so I looked at hundreds of definitions. They're mostly vernacular definitions, folk definitions, common definitions, whatever. And I came down with 5 criteria. And let's focus on the picture that you can see on your screen. Number 1, is that a stone wall? Well, some lawyers would say, no, it's not. It's just a long pile of stone, if it serves their advantage to say that. That's why you need to have a definition. So I would say a stone wall meets 5 criteria. Number 1, it has to be made of stone. All right. And I'm fine if it's synthetic stone, because there's some conglomerates that look a lot like concrete, so it just is made of stone. Number 2, it has to be granular. Notice there are hundreds of stones that you're looking at on that picture, rather than one. If you just had a slab of rock laid end to end, across that distance, it wouldn't be a stone wall because it's not granular. It's not made of particles. Okay. Number 3, it has to be continuous. Notice how that wall there is continuous. You can't walk through it. How unlike a stack of boulders, where you just have a set of boulders where it keeps the cars out, but you can walk right through it. That's not a wall. But if you were to take those boulders and push them together, it would be continuous. It would become a wall. All right. So that's how far have I gotten? Oh, and it has to be elongated. Is that longer than 4 times than it is wide? Yes. So it meets the criteria. Because 4 is the arbitrary number that I came up with, having asked lots of groups empirically. Is that a wall? Is that a wall? Is that a wall? Is that a wall? I just came up with the number that best worked on all those hundreds of questions. And then finally, it has to have a certain height. And height is the hardest one to define. We know that a stone patio is not a stone wall, right? But it meets every criteria except the elongation one and the height one. You see, it meets 3 of them, but not 2 of them. A stone cairn, we know what those look like. That doesn't meet the elongation one, but it meets every other one. You see? So it's actually tricky to define a stone wall, but it gets easy when you practice it a little bit. And this definition seems to work. At least it's published and now being used, I think, legally. And so it has to be high enough. And so height is meant 2 ways. If you have stones sitting on other stones, that's high enough, even if it's only ankle high. All right. And if you are dealing with individual stones that are pushed together, like boulders pushed together, it's got to be knee high. But it doesn't have to be thigh high. Just knee high works. And again, that's an arbitrary cutoff, but you do need these. So let me just be really quick here for whoever asked that question. Number 1, it has to be made of stone. It has to be granular. It has to be elongated. It has to be continuous, and it has to meet a minimum height requirement, usually just by having one stone on top of another. All right. And this one
Okay.
meets all five of them. So we can say, I'm confident that's a stone wall, which is going back to the definition I gave you. Everybody would know that's a wall without knowing the definition, but we don't know why we know it's a wall. So that's what I try to do, is reverse engineer, 1,000 statements and claims.
Now, here's an interesting question. Can you comment on a story I have heard that stone walls were built in response to a sheep disease issue in England and the need to import wool for the Manchester spinning industry from America?
Okay, I will answer this question by saying, no, I can't answer that question, but I can have an opinion on the subject. Okay, because I have been asked a sheep-related question probably, 100 times. And usually they're localized either to a historical event or a particular region. There's no question that New England had a lot of sheep at one time, and there's no question that it was involved in the post War of 1812 boycott of British wool, and no, of course, the import of merino sheep. There's all these stories that you can read about. But by my experience, especially as a young man in Alaska trying to chase down mountain sheep, they're designed for climbing, and I have never seen a good sheep fence, that didn't have electric wire on it. And because, they're built for climbing. And so, and sheep make a lot of stone walls. I don't think that you build walls to hold sheep. I think sheep, denude the landscape so much, you have so much stone, you have to build a wall, to get rid of the stone. I think we've got it backwards. And I think John Muir was the one that called sheep, woolly locusts or something like that. That's kind of, and of course sheep are cute, and, they taste good and they give us good wool and all, they're wonderful, wonderful domestic animals. But the relationship between stone walls and sheep is way complicated. And I've looked into it in a couple of places and I didn't get good resolution answers. I'll just leave it at that. Plead ignorance.
Sometimes no data is the actual data. That's what I always say.
I love that. Yeah. Sometimes no data is the actual data.
That's how I've got my way, weaseled my way through grad school. Thank you. All right. So one question coming in, I think this came in when we were talking about stone walls being repurposed. When the stone walls were being repurposed for roadbeds, were the landowners being paid for the material?
I don't even know. I could research that, but I haven't. I did look into it, and what I remembered was cases where the U.S. government was actually paying farmers, the Soil Conservation Service, to bury their walls to make drains. So it might go the other way. And I think that walls were probably, I think farmers were probably compensated, but in some cases, barbed wire here before we had, we had barbed wire before we had Model Ts. So I think a lot of farmers say just get rid of them all. We don't want them. I mean, we didn't have a necessity for ruins until we hit the middle of the 20th century, I think, or maybe the early 20th century. There's just a fantastic book by J. Brinkerhoff Jackson that when I read it, I thought, yeah, that's it. That is it. I'll just read this quickly. Oh, no, we're in Q&A. We're not in talk, so I won't read it quickly. But the basic idea is that there's a necessity for ruins. If you get past that golden age, like if there's the 19th century when people are walking away from their walls, there has to be an interval of neglect. When we don't want them or the trees take over before we can go back and reclaim, a former age and make it out to be better than it actually was. Okay, so I think that in the 19th century, the historic record is clear that a lot of farmers didn't want their walls. They would just be happy to get rid of them. But I'm sure that others cared for them and would have wanted to have them, be compensated for them. But I do know, I mean, I remember the first time I read about the staggering distance was in Susan Alpert's book. It was like 250,000 miles or something like that. And, within a decade, we will have, through machine learning and LiDAR, we will have a good estimate, but we're not quite there yet. But we're working towards that with some of the artificial intelligence, LiDAR mapping, and projects that I'm working on. I'm also working on another project to field truth well, that's a whole nother story. So we are working on it, but I'm guessing, just rule of thumb, we have about half of the original stone walls that were once here. I think more were taken down than than have been put up recently. And so that means we got 100,000 miles, still a lot. It's still an awful lot. And I don't think we should get rid of them except under unusual circumstances.
Yeah, I think people do really appreciate the stone walls that they have. Everybody, you don't see a lot of people wanting to tear them down or repurpose them in any
Well,
way.
there was a truck. I mean, I live in Mansfield, Connecticut, and there was a company right next door in Windham, and they had 3 blue trucks, like standard dump trucks, contractor dump trucks, and on the back was "We Buy Stone Walls," and they would drive around and just strip mine stone walls off of all the local properties around here. But they're out of business, and I had some real back and forths with them, in the New York Times, in the late maybe 2010 or something like that. They went out of business. I don't think it's, and I used to drive by landscape gardening places, and I would see all kinds of stone, with the lichen still hanging on them and the patina and the, and I just don't see that anymore. And I used to drive to the Rhode Island shore sometimes, and I would see, backhoes digging up stone walls on the way, and I don't see that anymore. I think that most people are considerate now of the fact that we need to appreciate them in a huge way, because we're never going to rebuild them the same way. And the other thing is, there's an issue of building stone walls that don't look like the ones where you are. If you had that wall, if you had a wall that looks like that, you replaced it with just vertical, slabs, it just wouldn't look like it belonged. And so I think there will be some regulations of trying to define, what should a wall look like. Yes, you're free to build a wall, but only under these specifications. I think that will happen. But I mean, there are some pretty crazy examples you see driving around.
Yeah. Now, someone has dropped a link into the chat, which I believe is your Smithsonian article. It's how stone
Okay.
walls became a signature landform
Yeah,
of New
that's
England.
it. Yeah,
Perfect.
that's it.
I will pop that link right into the follow-up email so everybody can go
We're at
get to read it.
100 participants still after all
Yeah.
this time. I think that's pretty good.
People that are interested in stone walls.
Yeah, it's you got 100%. Yeah, that's good.
So here's
That's
an
good.
interesting question about the role of enslaved labor in the history of stone walls in the Mid-Hudson Valley. Can you speak to that facet of the history?
Not in the Hudson Valley. I can only be general, and I think anything else would be dangerous. I don't think there's any questions that slaves built some walls, in and around Newport, for example, which was like the center of the slave trade, and in and around Boston. And there are some cases where there's just clear documentation that somebody went to clear land, with 20 slaves, and they, 10 years later, they had a whole bunch of walls. I think it's pretty clear that slaves built walls in particular places. However, I don't think it's a huge proportion. I think that if you look at the way they're built, if you have a foreman on a crew, right, or the boss, there's a specification for what a wall should look like, and you will see a lot of walls look similar. I mean, most of the wall is built similar, with some variations. And what you see for most of the walls around New England, even the one I'm looking at right now, is that they're kind of built higgledy-piggledy, one load at a time. A real farm wall doesn't look the same for more than about 20 feet. An estate wall looks similar, all the way around the corners of an estate, because the money is coming from outside, and the work is being done in one big capital improvement project. So walls look different under those circumstances than just I think that in general, most of the walls in New England are consistent with the observations that they were built, by the people from the farm with money from the farm. And that most of the estate walls later are built by money from outside the farm, by people who were hired to do a job. And it gets complicated, because as you get down close to the Hudson, and closer to New York City, the balance between rural walls built by farmers and the balance built by industrial money, with work crews, changes and flips. But I think if you're sensitive to both end members, you can kind of make that decision. And so I don't think there's any question that slaves were used to build some walls here and there. But my instinct is it's not a very big proportion. And the burden of proof, is on the person that's making that claim. I think the default is they're built by people who lived on the farm or who were hired by the farm with money from the farm. In other words, the local agrarian economy. I think that's most of the walls.
That's an interesting answer to a really interesting question. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So the next question, a little bit later, someone is asking if there's specific coordinates for interesting stone walls to see. So maybe your top three stone walls, and then if you're familiar with geocaching, where people
Yeah,
hide.
I'm familiar with it. I've never got into it, and I'm not very good at the GIS coordinate system. I'm not even very good doing it with my cell phone, but I do read the coordinates sometimes. And I do have a desktop. I do have an app on my desktop where I can get the coordinates on anything. And so I could do that, but I'm not in exploring stone walls. I'm trying to find a copy of it. Oh yeah, here's a copy of it.
There's always a resource, right? I love it.
It is actually, the problem is, I own the copyright to this because Bloomsbury just gave it up because they decided not, that's a prestigious London publisher, they didn't want to do a guidebook on stone walls. So this is, are you able to see this, or anybody out there can see it? Okay.
Yep.
So it's exploring stone walls, and there's a chapter at the end, and it's called Walls to Visit. And walls to visit break into two kinds. There are tourist walls and then noteworthy walls. And these are all over New England. So I'm going to go to 127, which is the walls to visit. And yes, and I have in there, so I have superlative walls in here. Let me see, where it is at noteworthy walls. Yes. I have, rock type walls. I have where you can go see gems and crystals, or size and form. I got the tallest wall. All right. Tallest wall fell over. It was the cliff walk in Newport, Rhode Island. It was the tallest wall that I've seen anywhere. All right. The widest wall, this is in Spring Hill, Connecticut. I'm not saying it's the widest one. I'm just saying it's a very wide one. It's like wider than a big truck. All right. And here's the bouldery wall, and that was Center Harbor, New Hampshire. I've never seen a wall built of such giant, colossal, granite boulders all stacked up like eggs, in a basket. A massive wall from the New Croton Reservoir in New York. All right, that's a really big wall. The most uniform distribution, Little Compton, Rhode Island, walls everywhere. The sharpest northern limit, Weld County, Maine. And then I get the best preserved walls, the oldest wall, the hidden wall, most famous wall, saddest wall, humble wall, most out of place wall, oddest wall, wannabe wall, Indian wall, important wall, unusual wall, and on and on and on. So yes, if you can get a hold of that book, it's in a lot of libraries. It's sold pretty well for a while, but it's out of print now. You don't want to spend $150 for it on Amazon, but you can find it. And the silly thing is that they just gave up the copyright, so I can do whatever I want with it, but I don't have time to do anything with it. I'm probably going to put the whole damn thing online, and make it available. But then that means I got to update it, and we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it is available.
I'll put the title in the follow-up email, and people can look for it at their used bookstores and their
Sure.
libraries.
Sure. It's definitely in used bookstore. Most people keep them though. It was reviewed in Northern Woodlands magazine. I think it was funny, if I got that right.
Mm-hmm.
It all gets to be a blur after 20 some odd years.
It's a lot of walls.
Yeah.
Now, here's a question. You talked a little bit about the height of the walls, and this question is asking whether the height was influenced by whether what was inside the wall was a pasture or a crop, so a livestock or a crop
definitely,
field.
definitely. I mean, the default. That was the one thing that Bill McKibben, he blurbs every book in the universe, but he blurbed this one. And what he said was, now I know why all the stone walls I've ever stumbled across in northern New England are thigh high, And so I would say the default is thigh high, and that's ergonomics. If you read stone by stone, you realize that lumbar injuries from moving stone is the number one problem. And so basically, if you think about the human frame, you can't get a wall much bigger than thigh high, or you start to have to lift it instead of swing it. And so that's the default. And a lot of walls, look at the one we're looking at, tops out right about thigh high. All right. And if you are if you are above that, you're starting to get into fence. But to make a real fence, the legal fence had to be 4.5 feet high in most places. And so if you've got a consistently high, fairly well built 4.5 feet, you're looking at a fence. But those are just trivial in proportion to the number that are lower than that. And I think most are knee high. And so that raises another interesting question. The stone we're looking at here, what if you imagine an A-frame of poles, above that, rails, so is that a stone wall or is it a hybrid wall if it has wood above it? Do we even call it a stone wall? That's a good question. I consider it a stone wall, but and I've been thinking a lot about this. The wooden fences are there before most of the stone walls. And wooden fences have always been more common than stone fences. So they were there. And what happened was you start pitching stone at the bottom of a wooden fence. What are you going to do? You're going to start sorting it and organizing it and go up. I've said this anecdote before. If you go into a public library, right, you don't have all the books on the floor. If all the books were on the floor, you wouldn't be able to walk into the library. So what do they do to make that work? They stack the books. Okay. So if you had just a whole zone just covered with stones lying around at odd spacing, you would be preempting all of that land for useful tillage or moorlands or whatever. What do you want to do to get it out of the way? You want to just stack it. So you want to stack it whether or not you want a fence. In other words, stacking is independent of fencing, but if you stack, you can use it as a fence. And so what happened is, I think more often than not, the stone grew up to replace the bottom part of a wooden fence, instead of having someone build a stone wall and then say, now I'm going to make it high enough to be a fence and put wood on top of it. And of course, there are journal books and diaries and things like that mention all kinds of little odds and ends, but they're never consistent. So
Yeah, it's a
I
lot to
think
think about. Looking at these stone walls as you trudge through our countryside here, and yeah, it's just really interesting thinking about like a key or something like that to identify what is a stone wall. It's
well,
cool
the
stuff.
the peer-reviewed historical archaeology, it's more than an article. It's a year late because it was so damn big. It took a long time to get it published, to find the space in the journal, and it's like 33 pages of journal article. It's like ridiculous,
Wow.
and it's full of pictures. And I think the first third of it is really interesting to me. And then the rest is just a lot of descriptive detail. How do you actually do this thing? But let me just tell you, it's a classification and a taxonomy. And if you want to make any progress in any field, you got to classify and name. And I thought that was the first step. So there's an article that I wrote in the conversation. I think there's been a couple more, and I'll send you the whole list there. But the basic idea is I really want to have a science of stone walls. And in order to do that, you got to start with definitions and classifications. As dull as it is, that's what you have to do. And there is one in Exploring Stone Walls, but it's old and it was improved. And I never wanted to, every year I went further on this business of classifying them, I'd say, oh, that was a mistake. Rats, and you'd fix something. And if anyone who's been a graduate student through the sciences knows that there's only two good taxonomies. And one is where you have a category for everything, right? And the other one is where you have one category for everything. So either, if you have, it's when you start grouping things that are different into comparable categories, then you start running into trouble everywhere, including climates. They're regional. So how do we classify them? And where's the boundaries? And how do we define them? You need to have definitions and classifications. And so what I've tried to do is take the stone domain, which is all of the stone, and classify it into 4 classes, stone walls being the dominant class, okay? And then if there's stone walls, there's 4 families of stone walls, okay? There's freestanding walls and flanking walls and supporting walls and blocking walls, you see? See what I'm getting at? And these are not things that you're using verbs, but we're really basing them on attributes that you can see. And so anybody could come up with the same definition just by making the same observations, and then a protocol for describing them. So it's all out there now, but it's not for the faint of heart. You have to, it's like working through any taxonomy. But I'll tell you something. I took plant taxonomy in college, and I obsessed on classification, and I just loved that course. And I just did it. I just did nothing but for a couple of months. And I really, really appreciated the value of a classification, even if they change.
Got
I
to be
know I'm
able to
off
define
topic here.
things, identify them to research them, right?
Yes, you need to have common names or you can't communicate. And if you can't communicate, you don't have a science. You just have a curious person doing something fun.
It's true. It's true. All right, the next question we have coming in kind of goes into the more of the cultural myths of stone walls. So I really appreciate it. I've heard some of our stone walls in the Berkshires, especially those we may find deep in the woods or mountainsides, were built by Native Americans prior to colonial times.
Yeah.
Was that possible?
Well, of course it's possible. I mean, they're strong enough that a pair of them could lift and move stone along, and do stuff. Now the problem is that, and this is a dicey ground, I mean, there are people that claim that most of the stone walls are actually, built by indigenous people before the Europeans even arrived, and at face value, that's just not true. But it doesn't stop people from claiming that. And there's no question that there is some kind of ceremonial stone structure, in this landscape that is indigenous. There's no way that people could live here for, 12,000 years and not build a short section of wall, to be an ambush site, or to have a place to sleep or get out of the wind, or build a pile of stone to commemorate somebody who died, or drop a stone I mean, there are historic examples, going way back to the Puritan days, where there were some stone structures, but they're mostly piles, and they're very rare, and they're and there are some odd shaped things, and these are often alleged to be indigenous, and they may be, but the burden of proof is on that claim, and it just doesn't get past good hypothesis driven, data driven scrutiny in most cases. And the anomaly is that if you look at all the early accounts, I mean, I'm talking 1650s or earlier, even Verrazano coming by, in the 16th century, they're just not reporting stone walls. I mean, it's a vacancy in the historic literature. But of course, there are some indigenous stone structures in the mess. And so I know how I described this once. Yes, it's like you're looking for a needle in a haystack. We all understand that metaphor. Somewhere out there, they're there. And when you have two stone piles, and one says it's a ceremonial stone pile, and the other one says it's a farmer's stone pile, there's no way to really resolve that issue, unless you agree on the terms ahead of time. What are you going to use for criteria or evidence? So I'm not dissing any of that, but I think that, if you're looking for a piece of hay in a needle stack, it's kind of like what's going on here. They're there, but they're so commingled and repurposed and modified, but they're not the big square fields or the big polygonal shaped fields. I mean, and the indigenous presence in the woodlands here, at most, these didn't burn that easily. Most of that presence is down in the valleys and on the gravel terraces and on the sand terraces, where you could, grow a crop and have a good trail. Just the uplands, good places for hunting, but not for anything else. They didn't break the sod, which is where most of the stone came from. And I tread gingerly on the subject because I'm, based on my observations and all of the evidence that I have gathered and seen. All right, these are related to land clearing and cultural manifestations of invasive Europeans, if you want to call them that. And I have also, but I know that there's some really odd structures out there that I have seen, that if I were leaning, I would say, yeah, that's probably an indigenous feature, but I don't know what it was for. And so in terms of wall function, there's one that I reserve. It's called the idiosyncratic function, and that's that you just do stuff for the hell of it. I mean, I have been out doing stuff, And I just do stuff and I have no reason. I just do it, especially when you're a teenager, you know? And I have no doubt that there are at least a few little covert love nests out there, for indigenous and or European teenagers. It doesn't make it a root cellar, but it doesn't make it a sacred lodge either.
I guess every stone wall tells a story, but they don't quite talk out loud yet.
They say a lot,
They
but
do.
they don't. The details are missing.
Yeah. Well, we're just about at 7:30, so let's do one more question and then close up for the night. We've had a couple of questions actually along this line asking about documenting the stone walls that they have on their property.
Oh,
Once they're how would you document these, and once you've done that, who would I share this with to document it for future generations?
okay. I think that's a great question. New Hampshire, of course, has a stonewall mapping program. They have citizen science mapping program where they have over 7,000 miles of stonewall mapped by people that just like to map stone walls and put bound. And I think that's really cool, but they're not described. So let me answer the question by saying, and it may sound a little self-serving, but the reason that I invented a classification and a definition and all of that is so we could describe and inventory walls. And so I would say start with that publication that you'll be sending out, all right? And describe it. And basically what's the order of stone, how big are the stones, what's the composition of the stones, how many segments are there, blah 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 blah. It's just basically it's just describing them. And that might be fun, especially if you're retired, you could basically just take the wall that we see here and just describe it. How many segments are there? How could you characterize it? And then basically you map it and describe it, and then it's documented. And that's a wonderful contribution. And so what I would like to do is have land trusts and towns and states and entities and private groups of whatever, to talk the same language, to use the same definitions and the same terminology. Have I got a flawless taxonomy? Of course not. But I put it off for 10 years because I kept improving it. And I eventually said, I better do this now. And it's out there and it will be criticized and parts of it will be revised, and I'll get harsh collegial criticism and so forth and so forth. But, it's out there. So if you can start to use it and then find problems with it, let me know. So I would say begin the process of inventory. It's in the document that you could share the document that I'm going to share with you to those people that are interested in inventory. And it starts with, a top-down LiDAR survey, see everything you can, and then a bottom-up, make sure that everybody, can geolocate the ends of the walls they want and bring them into a database, hopefully a town database or a land trust database. Right. And I'm doing this with the Department of Massachusetts Quabbin Reservoir, group, in a month or two. I'm starting to work with archaeologists and land use people and towns, to do this, but I'm not doing it as a consultant because I don't have any time to do it. But I'm trying to push, get the agenda to work and test it out and make sure that it works because it's doable. I don't, other people can do it. It's just a matter of reading and following and modifying for your own needs. You don't have to use everything. But so I would say inventory and describe, and share out. But you have a top down and a bottom up source, and then go in and inventory them. And then once you inventory them, now you have something you can manage. Like, well, we got 10 of these kinds and none of those kinds, and only one here. We better preserve that one because it's the only one of a kind on our whole property. You see, you don't know that if you just do in LiDAR. All you got is lengths. That's all you got. And what we're looking, for example, the wall that's in front of us is a wall. Okay, number one. Number two, it's a freestanding wall because it has two sides. All right. Number three, it looks like a single wall over most of its length because I don't see the other side. It's possible that it is. That means it's built from one side. And it is in terms of the degree of order, it's a laid wall on the left because those pieces are thought about when they're put into position. You hire a mason to build, but the rest of it doesn't look laid at all. It just looks like it's stacked. Are you following me? All right. And so that's probably, I would classify that as a 2-segment wall, one very long segment of stacked wall, and a shorter segment of laid wall, because I see a difference in that picture. And then I would describe the stones. They're probably gneisses or, granites or something like that, because that's true for most of them. And it's, knee high to thigh high. So there are things that you can describe. And what's the shape of the stones? Most of those stones are slabs. They're not tablets, and they're not balls, and they're not blocks, you see? So there's a shape that you could use to describe them. And on and on and on. By the time you spent an hour on that wall, you'd have a nice description just following the simple terminology. And the degree of order. Well, I've already done that. And the composition and the height and the geometry and the shape it's all straightforward.
Short and concise, right? That's the way to
Short
that's the way to do a taxonomy, right?
as short as possible, as short as possible.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Dr. Thorson, I want to thank you for your time tonight. We are past 7:30, and I don't want to
Okay.
keep you all night. This was really interesting. Folks hung around through a lot of questions.
We still have
And
71.
yeah, we're still doing great. There's still some pretty good questions left over too,
Yeah,
but
sorry about that.
no. I want to be gentle on people's time, and I want to be kind to
Yeah.
your time as well, because obviously this is a topic that's near and dear to us Eastern New York / New Englanders here. But yeah, we'll follow this up with a great deal of links that Dr. Thorson talked about this evening, and all sorts of things that we were chatted about with a nice lofty follow-up email. And I just want to say thank you everyone for attending tonight, and thank you, Dr. Thorson, for filling our heads with all this wonderful information.
Yeah, thank you. I'll send whatever links you need tomorrow.
Very much appreciate
Great,
it, sir.
thank you.
And it's been a pleasure working with you. And I can't see all the people in the audience, but I hope you're smiling. Even if okay, bye-bye.
I'm sure they are.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Yep.
Likewise.